This is the Court Leader's Advantage, a podcast series for court professionals and by court professionals. Brought to you by thecourtleader.net and in cooperation with NACM, the National Association for Court Management. In recent episodes, we've been talking about the various aspects of employee recruitment and selection, often as it intersects with diversity, equity, and inclusion. I started becoming interested in the power imbalance surrounding employee selection. Traditionally, job candidates entered the selection process in a powerless and often even a belittling position. The NACM Model Code of Conduct, Canon 1.4, states that court professionals treat individuals interacting with the court, and presumably this includes job candidates, in a respectful manner. So the question arises, is the power imbalance in the hiring process real? Is it disrespectful to job candidates? And do we who hire court employees actually have any interest in altering that power imbalance? I'm Pete Kiefer, and welcome to the Court Leader's Advantage podcast series. This month, we're looking into the power imbalance between employers and job candidates in the hiring process. Most of us have been on both sides of the interview table, and most of us can agree that applying for a job can be competitive. It can be nerve-wracking. Can it also be demeaning? Here to discuss these questions are Carl Tanis, Court Administrator for the 2nd Judicial Circuit Court in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. By Carl's estimate, he has sat in on over 125 interview panels. He has also interviewed for a job over 20 times. Rick Pierce, Judicial Programs Administrator for the Pennsylvania Administrative Office of the Courts. And Liz Rambo, Trial Court Administrator for the Lane County Circuit Court in Eugene, Oregon. Liz has sat in on over 250 interview panels. She has interviewed for a job over 15 times. I am pleased to mention that Liz is also the recipient of the 2023 Warren E. Berger Award for Excellence in Court Administration. Thank you all for joining today's podcast. Let's begin with our leadoff question. Do you think there's a power imbalance that favors employers over job candidates in the selection process? And if so, do we who hire court employees have any real interest in correcting this imbalance? Liz Rambo?
I would have to say, yes, there is definitely a power imbalance. It's really organic to the process. You are the person deciding the fate of a person that's come before you for a job. So by nature of this process, the power rests with the people sitting in the decision maker seat. And I think it's incumbent on us as decision makers to do everything we can do to help balance that, to set people at ease, to have real conversations that allow them to explore whether they want to work for us, right? And to give them some power back. So typically, we have question and answer sessions at the end. And one of the things I try to make sure to say is, this isn't just about me deciding if you should work for us. This is also you deciding if you want to work here, because that's important to me. And so I want the candidate to ask me questions about whatever they want to ask about, ranging from working environment to job duties, pay scale and benefits, whatever it is they need to know whether they want to work for us, because that's really critical to me. I don't want to hire people who end up deciding that the environment isn't good or that the job isn't what they expected, because our resources and time and effort in recruitment are huge. It's important that we get it right for both us and for the candidates. So I would say yes to everything you said.
Rick Pierce?
Yeah, I do believe that there is a power imbalance. And I think at one time it was more significantly slanted in favor of the employers. But I think that has started to change. And particularly for certain positions that you're looking to fill. If you're filling a position that may be for a front office clerk or a clerk in a limited jurisdiction court, the power may have already shifted. And I don't think we have a choice but to see that the courts no longer have that perceived power exclusively. We as employers must recognize the need for cultivating and growing those connections with a multi-generational workforce, which has been a significant shift over the last 10 years or so. And we must recognize that the disparate wants and needs of each generation, and then prepare to meet those needs and wants accordingly, or at least attempt to satisfy them.
Carl Tanis?
I think Liz put it very well. It is sort of organic to the process. I've got a job to award to someone. You need to pay the rent and buy groceries. And, I don't know how you redesign the process to make it more even. I think Rick is right too, though, that with generational shifts and a much, much tighter job market, that helps restore the balance, or establish a little more even playing field. But ultimately, we've got a job, you've got to pay the mortgage, and so there is an intrinsic power imbalance there. I think one other thing that crosses my mind with job interviews, it really depends on the level as well. I mean, when we do talk about power imbalances, or it depends on the purpose of the position, the role of the position. And I think as we get higher on the ladder, higher in the organizational chart, more secure in our careers, more secure in our personal lives and our personal economics, for that matter, it becomes more of a, well, we have a job to award, and is this a job? Would we be a good fit for each other? But that's an evolution, I think, that comes with longevity and the level of the job. I think for the great majority, the highest volume of court positions that we interview for, it's more a matter of, I have a job, you need a job, here we are, and we pick the best fit. So yeah, I agree with Liz. It's sort of intrinsic to the process, hard to get away from it.
Most folks on interview panels have questions that they like to ask because they find that candidates' responses are particularly revealing, especially for court supervisor or management positions. Do you have a question that you particularly like to ask? And what is the kind of answer that you would be looking for? Liz?
Yes, I do. And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking particularly about supervisory or management positions. I have a question I like to ask that gets at honesty and accountability. And it is this. I'll just tell you what the question is.
Sure.
It is something along the lines of, everyone makes mistakes or errors of judgment on the job. Can you describe an impactful mistake or error in judgment that you made? What happened and what did you do to recover from it? And I find this to be really a telling question. For one thing, I find that it's an easy way for me to consider to hear what they consider to be a true error in judgment, right? Because if they aren't willing to tell me the big one, then I wonder if they're going to be willing to tell me the big one on the job. Now, I know this is a competitive process, but as I've said, I like to set people at ease. I'm trying to say, I acknowledge we all make mistakes. Let's talk about it. So what they tell me is telling. What they talk about, if it's something simplistic, I'm kind of concerned, right?
Mm-hmm.
And also, I like to hear about how they recovered from it. Did they take accountability? Did they recover well or poorly? And frankly, sometimes the outcome of the error in judgment, when they talk about it, isn't as important to me as how they talk about it. So for example, if they took accountability and it didn't work and it was all a big failure, sometimes that's okay, right? It's just a really kind of a fun exploration with people. And I know it sounds like a really challenging question for a candidate. It is. But when I'm looking at supervisor or management positions, it's the kind of thing I really need to know about. Are people willing to talk about their mistakes, what they learned from them, how they recovered, and that kind of a thing? So I'm really looking for that person who can describe their foibles with honesty and take accountability and take steps to move forward.
Carl?
I think this is a really good question. And like Liz, I have some favorites myself. A couple of them are, I ask about office conflict. I ask them something along the lines of, can you give me an example of a time when you worked somewhere where there was a high level of conflict between office employees and how did you work through it? And what they use, just like Liz's example, what they use as their examples, what they recall, and their description of how they worked through it is very revealing to me. You know, of course, in job interviews, we're all diplomatic, we all polish things up a little bit. And so really, I think what we're trying to do here is get them to let the guard down just a little and give us some indications of messy times where they had to work through things, because offices are going to be messy. And so I sure appreciate it when a candidate rolls up his or her sleeves and gives us a really good example. And if they give an example that's too cautious, too sanitized, well, that's an indication in itself of their you know, their sort of their bravery level, the level of frankness they're willing to extend, that kind. So I find that pretty revealing. Another one that I use for court positions in particular, and this is a rough one, but I like to ask about a time when they've been treated badly by customers of the public, or those whom they have to serve, and how they work through that, how they rationalize not being treated well, because in court positions, often we're going to get blasted, and they should know that by the questions we're asked. And I think it's helpful for me to know how they're going to rationalize that, how they're going to get through it. You know, the typical response is, well, it's not personal. And that's true. But, you know, when you're at the counter getting blasted, sometimes it's hard to keep that in mind. And then finally, our clerk of court here at the moment spends a lot of time trying to make clear to candidates that you're going to see rough stuff, and particularly in courtrooms. And I know when I was a courtroom clerk a long time ago, I saw some stuff. I have some images in my head that I'd rather not have, and I've never been able to forget them. And so I think we just need to acknowledge, working for the court, we're going to see really rough, disturbing stuff, to the point where we sometimes talk about, you know, vicarious trauma and how we deal with those incredibly emotional, disturbing images or experiences. And so she spends a lot of time asking about just that, about how do you rationalize a really disturbing experience, or she tries to make them aware of the high stakes, rough things we see here at court. And it's a delicate thing to do. And she's had some candidates stand up in the middle of the job interview and say, this is not for me, this was not in the job posting. You know, in the long run, it's probably just as well that she does that, even though it can be awkward, it can be difficult. But I think that's one more area that's probably useful for court professionals to spend a little time on.
Rick?
Sure. I do have a particular question. When I was a trial court administrator, that I'd always ask, and regardless of the position, whether it was an entry-level clerk position or a director or supervisor position, and that is, I was looking for the individual to describe something that they are very passionate about, and to go into detail and why that is. And I'm talking about from a professional perspective, not so much personal, although they could share both. And I think the reason why I would ask that question was to really to make a kind of ascertain whether that individual would fit in with the chemistry of the unit that they were applying to, the people that they were working with. Would there be some type of ability to establish a connection? Because that seems to be so important, and the ability for individuals to engage one another leads to retention as well as to a harmonious workplace environment. And if you don't feel that you have that capability, I know it's difficult to make that judgment call in just a very short interview, particularly off of one question, but I think it is important to ask that question.
Do you give preference to candidates who have previous court experience? And does such a preference affect efforts to embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion? Rick?
Peter, I think it really depends upon the position. I think that most employers, public and private sectors, like what I would call a known quantity or a known quality. That means that someone with certain experiences may require less education or regarding the job skills. I do think someone outside may also may benefit outside of that, you know, your arena, so to speak, or your cocoon may also benefit because of the experiences they may bring to the position that may be of significant benefit to the department, the organization, or the court. I'm not certain if it does taint efforts to embrace DEI. On its face, it certainly appears to be an obstacle, absolutely. But I think if there are diligent leaders, and there are some, I'm not saying that everyone is, but diligent leaders and managers who truly seek an environment of belonging will seek out those individuals from all the groups, particularly the marginalized groups, and include everyone on an equal level. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. So in other words, these leaders will seek out the individuals from these groups that kind of do have that court experience if that trait, and only if that trait, is of the highest priority. I think that if it is not, then a good leader will dismiss that court experience, so to speak, and outright and seek those candidates from all the groups and realize that we're not going to necessarily prioritize court experience, and it is more important for us to get someone who has a different, maybe, or has a skill set that will fit in nicely with this particular organization or this particular group of people.
Liz?
Yeah, in the Oregon Judicial Department, we don't give formal preference points in screening for court experience specifically. We give experience points for any relevant experience, and obviously court experience is relevant, and that's in the screening process. So a person with court experience would screen into the interview with that experience, with a group of people with other relevant experience as well. But once we get to the interview, especially for frontline positions, I'm more concerned about the person being the fit for the court and the position. And sometimes prior court experience can be a negative if it appears in the interview that the candidate isn't willing to learn our ways, the right way. So, but you know what I mean? I mean, because people will relate their experiences how they relate them. And sometimes those experiences are court experiences that are a good fit for the job or for the organization, and sometimes they're not. If you had a court hiring process elsewhere that was exclusionary, and then you gave experience points for court experience specifically, then when you were interviewing, you'd be adopting that exclusionary process from wherever it came from. And so I can see it being a bit of a taint on efforts to embrace diversity. And we try to account for that here by including all relevant experience.
When hiring for a supervisor or management position, do you give preference to candidates who have a college degree or at least some college? And what's your reaction to the current movement to scrap the paper ceiling? In other words, to eliminate the requirement of college when hiring for positions. Carl?
Well, here again, I think it depends on the level of the position you're hiring. You know, the considerations will be different for frontline staff as compared to admin, for example, or higher level admin. But, and granted, the paper ceiling or the paper, you know, the completion of a degree, for example, I think helps with a few indicators. It's more likely the person's going to have decent writing skills. It's maybe an indicator of a good level of discipline. Although even there, you know, life experience has a lot of effect on suitability for a position. And so, you know, even though probably a lot of us here and all of us here on the panel are on this discussion are credentialed to the max, you know, as time goes by, it's a positive indicator, certainly, but I think of things like the last person I tried to recruit was an airline ticket agent. You know, the airlines always chronically understaff their check-in counters. People are always crabby and stressed. I watch how airline check-in staff handles really stressful, angry people, and I think, yes, that cool under pressure person would be really good. And she's tapping away at the computer, so I know she has some computer skills, and she's throwing suitcases around, or he's throwing suitcases around. So, you know, really a good, strong work ethic. When I think of credentialing, that's great. You know, it's got its value. But when I think of examples of good, solid work and good service to the public under great pressure. Those sorts of examples have a lot more bearing in my mind as time goes by.
Rick?
In some respects, it does. Here we're going to be a little bit subjective and a little bit inconsistent, perhaps, in my response, but I do think it does pertain to the particular job position, of course, between experience and educational background, the college degree, so to speak. But I also think that for those individuals who are, if we look at it completely from an experience perspective and put more complete emphasis on that and less or completely minimize whether an individual has a college degree or not, it does put those individuals who have taken the time to get a college degree at a disadvantage as well. Those individuals that are just starting in the workforce. It's a different story if an individual's been out of college for several years and had opportunities and has been in the workforce before, then I think that there's a little bit more of a balance there. But I will say that here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, there's a proposed legislation that's underway to have no requirement for a college degree for many of the state civil service positions, but these are generally under the auspices of the governor, at least at the outset, not necessarily the judiciary. Will that change for the courts? I don't know, but I will say that this was pushed. We have a new governor who's just come into office in the last 2 months, and this was part of his initiative when he mentioned it in his inaugural address.
We don't know how long it's going to last, but it does seem that right now the tables have turned, and job candidates seem to have more power of choice in the job search. Do you think that this change is temporary or permanent? And what recommendations do you have for people who are tuning in to today's episode? Liz?
So, do I think this is temporary or permanent? I think some aspects are going to be permanent, because I think generationally, for younger people coming into the workplace, they want more power and choice in their job, in what they do, than maybe, 35 years ago I was willing to push for. And so I think some aspects of that change are probably going to go forward into the future. And so a really smart colleague of mine here in Oregon, Julie Vredeveld, said this a while back. She said, I want us, OJD, to be the employer of choice. I want us to be the place where people want to work. And that is so true. I want us to be the place where people want to apply, where people want to work. There's a lot of work we have to do to make that happen. So, for example, y'all know that over the last couple of years, it's been really hard to keep up with salaries. And in Oregon, our salary structure for OJD employees wasn't tied to the market. So that made it really hard to adjust it. And so we were hiring people at embarrassing salaries over the last couple of years. And that makes it hard for us to be the employer of choice because people don't want to work for less than what they should be paid. So we spent the last 2 years in Oregon doing a humongous salary and job profile study. And it was a lot of work. I can't even tell you. Our contractor who worked with us said most of these efforts fail. We took all of our job profiles, rewrote them with the help of NCSC and some private contractors. We tied half of our jobs in our job profiles for the whole state of Oregon Judicial Department into the job market. So those ties are there. And then we slotted all the other job profiles around it. So when the market shifts again, if it does, and I'm only assuming in an upward way, where people outside of our court are being paid more to do similar work, we can quickly do a market analysis. That's like a 3-month project, not 2 years, and readjust our salary and compensation structure for the whole state. And so we have to be willing, I think, if you're asking what is my recommendation, to take on the work that it's going to take to be the employer of choice. And that's a lot of fronts. It's not just salary. It's making sure we're looking at diversity, inclusion, work at home opportunities, whatever they are, that we have to be the place where people want to work and to accommodate that shift in what the market of employees is looking for.
Rick?
I say embrace the change. And I would say prepare for the change to be permanent. It's not, I agree with Liz, maybe it won't, not all elements of it will be permanent, but with a generational change in the workforce and their interests being significantly and their needs being significantly different than previous generations, I think that this is something that's going to be of a demand, and that's going to shift the power, and it already has, to significant extents to the employee or the candidate when we're talking about interviewing than it is to the employer. And I would just say don't fight the current by going upstream. I do believe because of the workforce being changed, you're seeing the baby boomers begin to move out, and some of those Gen Xers are also moving out, and you have a completely different generation entering the workforce now, as well as two other generations that have not been in the workforce that long, and or certainly in maybe management positions. Regarding what we can do, I would say, and I hear what Liz is saying regarding particularly the finances, the salaries. We're not going to be able to compete there, and the benefits the health benefits that are added, that's generally not enough because individuals don't necessarily see that as a dollar amount unless they've spent significant amount of time in the workforce in another position where they had to pay the COBRA every month. But I will say that I think as employers and as courts in general, address what you can control. And what you can control is the workplace environment. We don't have a lot of control over salary structure. Yes, we can put in those requests, but we're not the funding authorities. But we do have control over the workplace environment. And that's something that good leaders should always be looking to address anyway. And this is one of the things that is definitely of interest and of a high priority for the generations that are just now entering in the workforce in full force. And that's why I would say this is a way of meeting their need, is if we address things like the flexible work scheduling, how you're working with one another and forming those collaborative partnerships. Those types of things that many of you have heard time and time again, they are under your control, and it is a lack of leadership, I think, when you do not take the initiative here and do not seize that and do your utmost to put that in a positive environment for your workforce, for your employees.
Carl?
When Rick started his response to that question, I thought to myself, it's too bad there's not a high five gesture in Zoom, because, embracing the change, I thought to myself, yes, because, I think to address whether it's a permanent or temporary shift, I think it is relatively permanent. Generational attitudes, just less hierarchical preoccupations, less rigidity in the hiring process, and I think that's all healthy. But I think Rick is exactly right. If we embrace this shift and make a hiring process more open, broader, more flexible, more conversational, I think that's such a healthy thing to do. My presiding judge at the moment happens to have a question she asks typically in job interviews. We'll walk in and sit down and she'll say, "What do you want us to know about you?" And I mean, it's an opportunity to ramble, but it's very open. I'm not sure if HR managers would be thrilled with that question or not. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. I mean, I can't think of anything wrong with it necessarily, but it is awfully broad and we get fascinating answers. But that's a sort of conversational, even the playing field kind of question that I think is really helpful. When an office is broadly representative, I just think it's happier, it's healthier, it makes for a good work team. And so if we loosen this up, if we broaden our thinking, if we embrace that change that Rick mentioned, I think we'll come out a lot better on the other side. Yeah, we're tightly bound by economics and state budgets, and courts are typically lower paid, I think, for most national surveys, but I think we can overcome that. Rick mentioned flex. The South Dakota salaries are not the highest in the country. For a while we were at the bottom. We've made a little progress lately, and so it's helped a little, but I've had employees turn down job offers from higher paid law firms because they say they don't want to lose flex. And now, to be honest, flex drives me nuts. There is always somebody not here. It's really annoying to me. It drives me crazy. And every time I talk to somebody about their work plan for the week, okay, we're going to do this project on Thursday, I have to ask, are you here Thursday? It drives me insane. But they find it vitally important, to the point where if I can hang on to you and you're a really great employee, I'll put up with that irritation, and I'll try to shut up, and I'll try not to signal my irritation. It's that sort of creative, flexible concentration on work conditions rather than paychecks that we're so limited on, that I think will really help us attract a good workforce and be the employer of choice that Liz mentioned.
I want to thank Rick Pierce, Liz Rambo, and Carl Tanis for sharing their experiences and thoughts concerning the power imbalance regarding employee selection. This is often an overlooked aspect of human resources in the courts. There is certainly more to this topic to explore and discuss. As always, my thanks to you court professionals tuning into today's episode. It goes without saying that the hiring process is a vital component of court administration. I know as court professionals, you take this process seriously and thoughtfully. Thank you. Join us on Tuesday, May 16th, for another episode dealing with the issues facing our courts. This has been the Court Leaders Advantage podcast series. I'm Pete Kiefer, and thanks for joining us today. Thanks for joining us today. The Court Leaders Advantage is a regular podcast on courts and court administration. Today's episode will be available on our website, on YouTube, on Facebook, on iTunes, on LinkedIn, and on Twitter. Become part of the conversation. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, email us. Our address is CLApodcast, that's all one word, @nacmnet.org. Did you hear an interesting comment by one of the panelists that you would like to listen to again, but you don't want to search through the entire episode to find it? The additional resources section of the webpage contains a question time marker sheet. Just find the discussion question on the sheet, and next to it is the time that question was asked. You can then quickly fast forward to that time in the episode and listen to the panelists' comments. Remember, if you don't have time to watch an episode, you can always listen to the audio version. Listen in your car or on the bus on your way to or from work. You never have to miss an episode. I'm Pete Kiefer, and on behalf of our guests, the Court Leader website, and the National Association for Court Management, thank you, and have a great day. The views, information, and opinions expressed during this episode are solely those of the host and the individual presenters. They do not necessarily represent the position of the National Association for Court Management.